All right, let's dive into a case that's really hard to shake off the Menendez brothers' trials.
Yeah, it's one of those cases.
We're using the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals document, basically. Kind of
Sure.
lays it all out. So
Definitely.
picture this. Beverly Hills, 1989.
Okay.
Two very wealthy parents.
Yes.
Brutally murdered, and their sons are claiming self-defense.
Right.
It's a story of alleged abuse and a fight for a huge inheritance and a lot of legal maneuvering. So,
Yeah, this case really makes you think about, like, truth and justice, those big questions. Like,
yeah.
how do we even decide who's guilty? It's not just about who did it, but why they did it. It makes you question everything you think you know about families, about wealth, and how far people will go to protect themselves.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. August 20th, 1989, José and Kitty Menendez are found dead in their Beverly Hills mansion.
Right.
Multiple shotgun blasts. Really gruesome.
Yeah.
At first, it looks like a mob hit.
Yeah, that's what they thought at first.
Then their sons, Lyle and Erik, they call 911. They sound really upset, claiming they just found the bodies, but
But then things get a little strange.
it takes a turn.
That whole mob hit theory goes out the window pretty quickly.
Right?
The brothers start spending their parents' money like crazy. We're talking sports cars, luxury watches, you name it, and their alibis. They don't really hold up. The prosecution sees this and they think, okay, motive, greed. They wanted the money and they were willing to do whatever it took.
Yeah, if this were a movie, it'd be over.
Right.
Case closed.
But this is real life.
Not so simple.
Yeah.
The defense comes back swinging, okay? Lyle and Erik claim they were abused by their parents for years. Physically, sexually, psychologically. They say killing their parents wasn't about money, it was about survival. They were terrified and felt they had no other choice.
This is where the legal stuff gets really interesting. The defense is using this idea of imperfect self-defense. So the brothers believed they were in danger, even if that belief wasn't, reasonable to someone else. But proving that in court, that's tough. Try convincing a jury that you were so scared for your life that you had to use deadly force, even if someone looking from the outside might not see it that way.
Right. So to support their claims, Erik actually takes the stand and describes years of alleged abuse in horrific detail.
Wow.
He even talks about being sexually abused by their father.
Oh, wow.
The defense brings in family and friends who say they saw signs of abuse, bolstering the brothers' story. But the prosecution isn't convinced. They question how consistent these stories are, suggesting they're made up to win the jury's sympathy. It really becomes a battle of who's more believable.
It's a tough one. And then there's the therapy tapes.
Right.
Erik confesses to the murders during therapy sessions with Dr. Oziel.
Wow.
And when Lyle finds out, he threatens the therapist. Can you imagine being that therapist? Patient confidentiality versus potentially stopping something terrible from happening?
That's a tough spot. And the defense argues that these tapes shouldn't be allowed in court, citing patient confidentiality, attorney-client privilege, especially since Lyle and Erik had talked to an attorney, Gerald Chaliff, before these sessions. But
the court says the tapes can be used.
Yeah.
They say the therapy was mostly for mental health, not for legal defense.
And that was a huge turning point.
Yeah.
Now you have the brothers' own words that seem to contradict their self-defense claims. The prosecution's argument for premeditation starts looking a lot stronger.
Yeah, I see that. So the legal battle keeps going. The defense wants the jury to be told about imperfect self-defense. They want to highlight how scared the brothers were. But the court says, hold on. They say there wasn't enough proof of imminent peril when the killings happened.
And that's really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Imminent peril is like the foundation of self-defense. It means the threat has to be happening right then, not some fear of what might happen in the future. So even if the brothers were truly afraid of their parents, the court's saying that fear didn't justify killing them at that moment.
And it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
The defense wants to bring in more people, source witnesses, to talk about the alleged abuse, explain the brothers' state of mind. But the court puts limits on what they can say.
Right.
They decide some of it's repetitive or it doesn't directly connect to what the brothers did on the night of the murders. They're trying to keep things focused on the actual crime, not every single instance of alleged abuse.
Yeah, that makes sense. It shows the balance the legal system has to strike. You want to give the defendant every chance to defend themselves, but you also have to make sure the jury isn't overloaded with information that might not be relevant or might be too emotional. It's a tough line to walk.
Absolutely. Then we get to the closing arguments, and things get a little heated. Lyle's defense team is angry because the prosecutor pointed out there wasn't much evidence to back up the abuse claims. And the fact that Lyle didn't bring in any mental health experts to testify for him. They say it's unfair, especially since they were blocked from presenting some of that evidence.
So what did the court say?
The court disagreed. They said the prosecutor's comments were okay because he was just pointing out the holes in the defense's story and the lack of solid evidence to support their claims. Basically, he's allowed to say, hey, look what's missing.
Interesting. So you've got these two competing stories, a mountain of evidence, a lot of legal back and forth.
Yeah. What happens next? Well, the first trials, they end with hung juries.
Hung juries.
Two separate juries, both unable to agree on a verdict.
Wow.
Some jurors voted for first-degree murder, some for manslaughter. It was all over the place. Seems like nobody could decide for sure if Lyle and Erik were cold-blooded killers or terrified victims pushed to their breaking point.
That's really interesting. I mean, the juries couldn't agree. Shows how complex and divisive this case was. It makes you think about how powerful storytelling is in court and how hard it is to figure out the truth when you have such different versions of what happened.
And of course, this means we need a second trial, which is where things really heat up and where we get the final verdict and what ultimately happens to the brothers.
Okay.
But we'll get into that after quick.
But that second trial, it really had a different energy.
Yeah.
Both sides, the prosecution and the defense, they kind of changed their game plan after those hung juries.
Right. They learned from that first round.
Yeah.
So one big difference. Lyle, he testified in that first trial, remember?
Mm-hmm.
All those chilling details about the abuse he claimed he suffered. Well, he decided not to say a word this time.
Oh, wow.
So without him directly telling his story, the court put the brakes on some of the other witnesses who were going to back him up.
See, that's what I mean about legal strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lyle not speaking actually kind of hurt the defense. They couldn't present as much evidence about the abuse without him. And the court, they had to stick to the rules, right? No unsubstantiated testimony. It just shows how one decision can have a huge impact on the whole case.
It's like a game of chess, almost.
Exactly.
And speaking of strategy, the prosecution, they had some wins in this second trial, too.
Okay.
They managed to block some of that source witness testimony that was allowed in the first trial.
Interesting. So they really narrowed their focus.
They did.
They kept hammering on those events of the murders themselves, saying some of those specific abuse stories were just too repetitive or didn't really connect to the brothers' state of mind that night.
Right. Cut out the distractions, keep it streamlined.
Yep. Minimize those emotional appeals, stick to the hard facts.
Exactly. So with those limits in place, the second trial unfolds. Erik, he takes the stand again, tells his side of the story. But without Lyle's testimony and with less support from those other witnesses, the defense's case.
It's weaker.
Definitely weaker.
And you could see the difference, right? This time, the jury, just one jury for both brothers, they all agreed. Guilty of first-degree murder.
Wow.
But it gets heavier, right? They were also found guilty of lying in wait, meaning they planned those murders ahead of time. And then the multiple murders charge, that meant they were looking at a way harsher sentence.
It changed the whole game.
It did.
And a harsher sentence they got.
Yeah.
Lyle and Erik sentenced to life in prison without parole. A totally different outcome from those hung juries and the range of charges in that first trial. That second trial, with all the strategy shifts and legal rulings, it really tipped the scales.
It really highlights how much those legal moves matter. You know, makes you think about how much the evidence that was allowed in court influenced what the jury believed.
For sure.
And in a system where each side is so carefully crafting their story, how do we even define what justice is? Like, what does that even mean?
It's a tough question. Two trials, two completely different outcomes. One where the juries were totally split, and the other with guilty verdict, no hesitation.
Right.
Makes you wonder how much influence all that courtroom maneuvering has on whether someone is seen as guilty or innocent.
Absolutely. This whole Menendez case is like a spotlight on how the legal system is this battle of narratives. Both sides presented a compelling story. The prosecution, they focused on cold-blooded greed, a carefully planned act painting the brothers as ruthless.
And the defense?
They focused on years of horrible abuse, a desperate attempt to survive, portraying them as victims.
Pushed to their limit.
Exactly.
But in the end, the jury in that second trial, they went with the prosecution's story.
They did. And the question for everyone listening is, what do you think?
Right, that's what this deep dive is all about, right? We've gone over the facts, the legal arguments, the different interpretations.
Now it's your turn.
Exactly.
Weigh the evidence, wrestle with those complexities, think about those lingering questions. Was it cold-blooded murder for money? Or a desperate act of self-defense after years of trauma? Were they master manipulators? or deeply wounded victims.
This case makes us face some hard truths about abuse, family dynamics, and the limits of our legal system. It brings up these fundamental questions about how we define justice, interpret evidence, decide what to believe.
Exactly. If this has sparked your curiosity, keep digging.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff out there.
Articles, documentaries, analyses that go even deeper.
It's a rabbit hole for sure.
It is.
This case, even after all these years, it still fascinates people, still makes us question our ideas of justice and truth.
It reminds us that trying to understand these complex issues, it's a journey, not a destination.
And that's what makes these deep dives so interesting.
Right.
We get to explore these multi-layered stories, break down the complexities,
And often end up with more questions.
than answers.
Exactly.
It's about engaging with the information, challenging our assumptions, and reaching our own conclusions.
So keep thinking.
Keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
So we've really gone through it all, huh? The trials, the legal battles, those completely different stories.
We have, but
Yeah.
there's another side of this case. We need to look at the impact it had on society.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
The Menendez brothers case, it wasn't just some courtroom drama.
Right.
It blew up, right? Became this huge cultural phenomenon, sparked all these debates about wealth and privilege, about whether to believe abuse claims, what justice even means.
Yeah, it's like the case became this mirror reflecting all of society's anxieties.
Exactly.
Some people saw these brothers as spoiled rich kids who got away with murder for way too long.
Right.
Others saw them as victims, failed by the very system that should have protected them.
It really divided people.
It did.
And it made everyone question, those power dynamics in families, especially wealthy ones.
Right.
Could such horrific abuse really happen without anyone knowing? Or was it easier to just believe that money shielded people from that kind of darkness?
It's a tough question to grapple with.
It is.
And we can't forget about the media frenzy.
Oh, yeah.
It was everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, TV talk shows.
Non-stop coverage.
This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a public spectacle, for sure.
Absolutely.
And that media coverage, it definitely shaped how the public saw the case.
For sure.
Those images of the brothers spending their parents' money like crazy after the murders.
Yeah.
Plastered all over the headlines.
Fueled that whole greed and entitlement narrative.
It did.
But then you also had those graphic descriptions of the alleged abuse that got out there too. Forced people to confront this really uncomfortable truth about how hidden domestic violence can be.
So this case, it became this lightning rod for all these complex issues.
Yeah.
We started talking about the justice system itself.
Right.
Is it really blind to wealth and privilege? Can a regular jury really understand what goes on in a family full of secrets and power imbalances?
Big questions. Right. And it also made us rethink what it means to be a victim.
Yeah.
Could someone be both a victim and a perpetrator? Can years of trauma justify taking a life? These are questions we're still struggling with today.
This case, it wasn't just about legal arguments and strategy. It was about human nature. The gray areas of truth, what justice really means.
Exactly. It makes us look at ourselves,
Yeah.
examine our own biases and assumptions, ask those hard questions about the world we live in, the systems we depend on.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive into the Menendez brothers case. More questions than answers.
Always.
Was it cold-blooded murder? A desperate act of self-defense? Were Lyle and Erik masterminds or victims of a broken system? We'll probably never know for sure.
But that's the thing about these kinds of stories, isn't it?
What is it?
It's not about finding that one definitive answer.
Right.
It's about the process, thinking critically, challenging what we think we know, acknowledging that there are gray areas.
It's about realizing that sometimes truth is hard to find, and justice is in the eye of the beholder.
Exactly.
The Menendez brothers case reminds us that sometimes the most important answers aren't found in a courtroom, but in the conversations we have with ourselves and with each other.
Keep those questions in mind as you move forward, right?
Absolutely. And remember, the best deep dives are the ones that stick with you.
Long after the episode is over.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us.
And until next time.
Keep diving deep